Hey, welcome to our next video. Last time, as we added complex logic in our session handling, and complex logic always should be tested. So this time I will show you how to configure and write integration tests with using test containers. So you have a database running in a container just for your test, so it's not interfering with your production or development database, and you can easily connect to this database in debug and look inside what's stored for debugging reasons. First, we will create a Postgres container with test containers, and in here we will configure our Postgres container. So which sort of database we want to use. In this case, it's a Postgres, and also we will configure the name, user, password, and so on in this file in here. The image we will use is Postgres 15. You could use any image you want. And we will extend PostgreSQL container from test containers, and we will pass the image, so the Postgres image in the super keyword. Now we will handle this as a singleton, so if it's created once, we will just get the instance, and if it's not created yet, we will then create a new singleton instance of it. We will, as a parameter, we will have the host port, so we will later, if we want, create multiple containers. Or you can, not multiple containers, but you can define the port from outside. So now we will say add the database name, which should be created. It's working just like a standard Postgres image in Docker. We need to expose the port, and we will need to set a user and a password, and we will also set some mapping. So we will map the host port to the internal exposed port. And in the end, we will just return this container. Now we need to override two methods, one to start and one to stop our container. It will automatically start when it won't automatically stop. We will start it, but stopping will be handled when the all tests are done. Now we need some way to initialize and start up our Postgres container, and we also need to set the database name, the URL, the username, password to our application context properties. So if you remember, if you're using a database in Spring Boot, and if you not add URL and so on, JDBC URL to the application YAML or application properties, Spring Boot won't start. The same would happen with our test cases in here. And we need to overwrite this, and we will do this in here in our initialize. As for our test, I will create also a separated YAML file where I will specify the host port. Also, with this file, I later can configure my environment specific for my integration test or my unit test, but in this state it's for integration test. And so I can have different settings in my app than in my test. Maybe I want more explicit logging in my tests, for example. I can configure that in this application-integrationtest.yml, and that's just a name. You can use any name. You have to provide the name at some place as an active profile, and we will see that in a few minutes. So right here we can use the test property values, and we can in here define our database URL, username and password, and we will retrieve this from the container we just created. So it can't be wrong because it's directly from the container we're working with. And with that we just need to apply it and it will be working. What we now need is a place where we can initialize our container, because we don't want to do that every time in our integration test over and over. So I will just create a custom-made annotation, and in here I will add the typical annotations with target, retention, and so on. Type is for classes and retention is at runtime. And we will also add the Spring Boot test annotation, which is the normally used annotation, but we won't use it because we will use it in here. So we just need in the end one annotation to declare an integration test. And in here we have the context configuration where we can call our initializer. And now, last but not least, we set the integration test or integrations test as an active profile. So if you have an application and then the minus integration test, or everything after the minus is the name of the profile. So now we created a test just for our session service, and we just add integration test, and that's everything we need to do right now to write our test. Every new integration test just needs this annotation, and everything is set up in the background. First test we will make is just set a session, or test if a session is set. There are multiple ways how to build tests and how to do it, and I in here will use the fast way, but first we will just try out if our containers are starting at all, our Postgres containers. As you see in here, there is a Testcontainers new container which is from Testcontainers, and the other container we saw, and there was a second Postgres container, so the Postgres container just for these tests. Now we can start to write our test. I will use the controllers to test, but I probably would not do this if I had more time, because I can test the session service methods way better just with calling the session service method, not the login method or whatever, or the refresh method as it will do in here. But it's the fastest way, and writing tests can take quite some time, and I don't want to record 5 hours of writing tests. So I just give you the configuration and example test, and with that you can write your own test later on. And yeah, so the idea now is we will just use our username, our password. We know we have the second script from Flyware will also be inserted in here, so we have this admin user, or this user from start on, and we will just use him to log in, and we will receive a token, and we can then check, is the session created, is the session set. If I had to do it with calling the session method right now, I had to create No, it was already there, but I had to create the authentication object and so on, and it would be a bit more troublesome. Right now this is all handled here with the login as it should. But as I said, if you want to test the servers with the server's message, it's better to test them directly. And very important in tests, you actually need the add autowired at the controller if you use controller injection. While it's in the normal Spring Boot application outside of the test cases, you don't need that autowired anymore. And it's also recommended to not to use it. So now we will just fetch the sessions after login in. I will fetch fetch optional by token, and should be one session found, and if it's empty we have an issue. And I also like to add some comments in here in the test just for orientation, so the init, the run, and the part where the assertion happens. Let us check. It's not empty. Probably there's a method also is present, but should work the same way. And now we will see if it's running. So actually we need now to grab the session from our PostgresContainer database. And we actually found the session. So for that case everything is working. And in the next step I will add another test and another little part of configuration, which is the BeforeEachHook, and it implements the BeforeEach callback. And if you register that, every code in here will be called for every test. So what I will do in here now is using the clock. I don't want to set the clock every time, clock configuration, but sometimes I also want to override it. I want to mock it, and we will see example of mocking the clock. And that's why I always add the clock in my application to local datetime.now, local date.now, and so on. So in test cases, for example, or when someone is using a different time zone and so on, I can use this clock to have influence over this local datetime now and so on. So in that case, I will in the next test want to check if a token is expired or a session is expired. And with that I will just generate a token in the moment, and then I will just say mock the clock 2 hours in the future, and as I expect then that my request will be blocked and forbidden and marked as forbidden. So that's the power of using the clock in your application, especially for test cases. So just adding those defaults in here. And now we can register this hook in our custom annotation. And we can do this with add extend with. Maybe know this from using with Mockito. And the only thing right now is missing is we have a custom configuration class. We can also use it in there and import it. So now let's write the last test for today's video and then try to run all of our tests, which are 2 right now, not too many, and see if it's working. Good thing, I can copy here a lot. The test will work like that. That I will log in, I will receive a token, I will refresh one time, see if that's working, and it's 200, and with this next token I will take this and I will change the clock 2 hours into the future, and then I expect forbidden. So that's the first run. We'll just do a little refresh. Yeah, HTTP entity is the name is not telling me much. And the return type will be void because our endpoint just not return any body, just a status code and a token in the header. We can now grab that token. We can also assert the status code. So in here I set the clock. And every code after this line is now plus 2 hours. And that's very useful in many places where you want to jump around in the future, in the past, to test different stuff if something is expired and so on. And now we will get the token from our response, and we use the get first method in here because it could also be an array of values, like if you're sending an array of IDs or names or whatever, but we are just interested in the first. And now this refresh should fail. But as we asserted as a failure and forbidden, our test should pass. And now the only thing is missing is assert. And I really like that SZ method because it's very powerful. But there are so many ways to asserting, also with multiple parameters. So let's see what's happening. If our test is also working. And if a test is working, it's not a bad idea just to test it if it's not working. So if you expect forbidden and the test is green, just sometimes try to set it off okay and see if it actually fails when you set it okay, or if it just always returns green. Would be kind of bad, right? So I know, just to see if it's not already red there and forbidden there, I will add it is equal to okay. And also a very, 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 very important aspect. Clean your database or set your database to the starting position after every test you run. Right now I am just setting up sessions. So the only tables that are created are sessions, and with that I only have to clean up the session table. But if you create dozens of entries in different tables, please clean them all up afterwards. So now the is session expired, failed. In that case, status quo was expected to be okay, but was actually 403, and that's good. I added this use case, then there is something missing actually. If you look at the headers I set, and what is it? I can just run it again. Maybe nothing changed, but expecting change nothing, expecting a different result will not work. But maybe you spotted the bug already. It's in line 78, and also next step, if you don't have a clue, just press the debug. And you can debug your tests. You will jump right into them and see all the values. So there's this little tab variables, and you can see in here 200, forbidden, and maybe I will see the error soon. Yeah, I guess that was the point. I found it. It's actually BeforeEachHook. Yeah, we have a prefix, and I didn't set the prefix in here. And the same at this point. So it was indeed 403 in that last asset, but it was not for the reason I expected it to be. So now, as we fix it, we should have okay, and 403 forbidden. And that looks good. Now always try to run all tests, not just a single test. You need to try to run all tests. That just failed because I was too fast, and the Testcontainers hadn't enough time to properly shut down and start up again. So always run all your tests together, so you see if maybe they're working on their own, but you forget to drop and delete and clean up your database, and this one test is disturbing another test, and you need to clean that up. So that's all for today. I wish you a nice day, and I also added a little pipeline in the end. So as we have tests now, we should also run this test always, at least in the master, when we push to our repository. With that, have a nice day and keep going on.